Ratchet & Clank was a really fun game about a slim-waisted alien cat and his pet Bucket going on an interstellar adventure, platforming and shooting things up in an effort to save the universe from the greatest threat it's ever known: capitalism. Ratchet & Clank 2 was almost exactly the same thing, but again, and more, and they're both fantastic games. They're action-packed, weapon-packed, platforming-packed, fun-packed, in-plastic-packed games. While I do prefer the first one because I liked its story, levels and presentation more, the second one has its merits too, with a wider selection of wacky weapons, as well as some new, non-intrusive gameplay ideas. When it comes to the third game, I have no fear going into it. Well, okay, I have a little bit of fear, because in platformer trilogies of this nature, the third game is always the oddball for better or worse. Usually for worse. They often have some sort of meltdown and try and reinvent themselves as something new, a midlife crisis at the age of 3. But I don't think Ratchet & Clank 3 is likely to head in that direction. The series so far has established a fantastic formula. They would be foolish to deviate into some gimmicky Mario Party bullshit. I'm expecting more of the same, but bigger and better than ever before. Let's see what Ratchet & Clank 3 has up its arsenal. That's the name of the game, by the way, Up Your Arsenal, which explains where Ratchet keeps all his weapons, and I've gotta say, I'm impressed. If he's carrying this many weapons around with him, and he's storing them all up his arsenal, then he's gotta have the loosest sphincter in the known universe. The man has talent. Anyway, the game. The game begins with an introductory cutscene and opening level that occur with an unbelievable greyhound out of a trap-like pace. It honestly felt like the opening of this game was over before it started. Ratchet and Clank are hanging out at home watching TV when Ratchet, sick of watching Clank be a successful James Bond ripoff, changes the channel to a news report of his home planet Velden being attacked by a pack of aliens known as Tyrannoids, and that a certain Dr. Nefarious is behind it. Without even thinking about it for a second, Ratchet and Clank rush to Velden to save the planet from certain doom. Through a brief tutorial on Velden, it's clear that this game is following in the footsteps of the previous games, and so it fucking should. They didn't need to reinvent the wheel, so they didn't try to reinvent the wheel. What they have done though, is apply the wheel in a new way. Most of the level is the same Ratchet and Clank we know and love, with weapons that are technically new, but fulfill very similar functions to weapons we've seen before. But then, seeing as Ratchet and Clank have joined the army for some reason, they are deployed into actual battle scenarios. The final stretch of Velden involves the two jumping out of a plane and into the fray. A battle is taking place, and Ratchet and Clank have a mission: to clear out all of the enemies. In other words, making all those red dots on the minimap disappear. These battle scenarios appear frequently throughout the game, and often involve various other objectives like repairing defenses or defending your fellow soldiers. It's a different take on the combat, but it's the same combat, which I thought was really cool. It was a satisfying and reassuring introduction to this game. I felt like I was in safe hands, and that Ratchet & Clank 3 wouldn't have any nasty surprises up its arsenal. No hemorrhoids or anal fissures for me. But the one thing I did notice that was odd was the pacing of it all. Everything began and then was over so quickly. From the actual narrative told through the cutscenes, to the level of Velden itself, and the speed with which the story continued on from there was unlike anything I've ever seen in a game before. It didn't feel like the opening was rushed, it felt like the opening was rushing. Like it was trying to get through it as quickly as possible and move on to the next thing. Which was a really bizarre feeling. I barely had enough time to process what was going on and familiarize myself with all these unfamiliar characters. I booted up the game, and not 10 minutes later, I'm already into the second level. I'd understand that with something like Mario, where the levels are short and progress is expected to be fast, but with Ratchet & Clank, levels aren't normally over that quickly. But still, I pressed on. The following two levels, Florana and Marcadia, definitely confirm that this game was sticking to the Ratchet & Clank formula very closely. The Lombax robot duo must explore a variety of strange planets, presented to them as linear 3D levels. These levels are almost always teeming with enemies, usually either Tyrannoids or robots, sometimes both. Using all of the weapons he's storing in his arsenal, Ratchet must mow these enemies down in high-octane combat scenarios. This is no different to the previous two games, and it's just as engaging here as it was there. In a way, it could be considered less engaging, because I feel that this game doesn't have as many unique weapons. The weapons in this game just kind of feel like recycled versions of previous weapons, which is not a bad thing outright. The weapons are all fun to use, but I just feel the previous games, the second one in particular, had a wider variety of weapons available. But, on the other hand, Ratchet & Clank 3's weapons are also, in a way, more engaging because of XP. XP existed in Ratchet & Clank 2. By continuously using a weapon to annihilate your feeble enemies, weapons would gain XP, which would eventually lead them to leveling up, becoming stronger with each stage of upgrade. Ratchet Clank 3 also has this mechanic, but XP is gained a lot faster, and weapons have more stages of upgrade available to them. This makes it easy to upgrade a lot of weapons without having to hyper-focus on a select few, rewarding you for diversifying and trying out new weapons. It's like if you got a promotion in the army for every time you found a new way to kill a prisoner of war. What a great feeling! XP doesn't just upgrade your weapons, it also upgrades Ratchet & Clank themselves. They can also earn XP with each successful kill. This makes them sound like murderers, which I guess in a way they are. With enough XP they can upgrade their total health, making them more durable out in the battlefield. And that's important because there's a much greater focus on combat in this game compared to the other two. The combat was always the main focus, I feel, but in the third game it feels even more so. The combat is almost constant, especially when you factor in all those battle scenarios. Those are almost entirely combat apart from the few instances where you pilot some kind of vehicle. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, the combat was always the gameplay's strongest element and it is really fun. It's fun to blast your way through heated battles and experiment with all the different weapons. I have no problem with that at all. But I do feel like the other gameplay elements kind of got neglected a bit in this game. Ratchet & Clank wasn't just exclusively about gunplay, it was never supposed to be a child-friendly, sci-fi Call of Duty. Its gameplay also had other components. Platforming was one of them. It obviously still exists in Ratchet & Clank 3, there are even some sections of certain levels dedicated entirely to platforming gauntlets, but these are few and far between. Any other platforming manifests in the form of, like, a couple of ledges you need to climb up, or maybe a bit of wall jumping here and there. It really has taken a back seat. The same can be said about gadgets. Gadgets were a huge part of the previous games. You had things like the swing shot for mobility, gadgets for hacking locks, raising and lowering water levels, freezing and thawing things, disguising yourself, metal detecting, hypnotizing enemy robots. There's so much variety in these gadgets that led to a wide range of different scenarios the game could put you in. They all had so many applications. Ratchet & Clank are essentially Swiss Army knives. In this game, it feels like they're just carrying a Swiss Army knife. The number of gadgets you use in this game is about 5, and half of them are only useful a couple of times each. You have the Hypershot, which is just the dynamo and swing shot from the last game mashed together, and the Hacker, which lets you unlock doors by playing this lockpicking minigame. These are some of the more useful gadgets. You have the Warp Pad, which is a very late game gadget that is only useful very situationally when you need to move quickly from one specific spot to another specific spot. I only remember using it a couple of times. You've got a rehash of the Holo Geyser from the first game, only now it disguises you as a Tyrannoid instead of a robot, allowing you to have conversations with other Tyrannoids. You use it maybe twice. The only gadget of any real significance is the Refractor, which actually comes into play quite often. With it, you can redirect lasers in these little laser puzzles, with the goal being to guide the lasers into the switches to activate something, usually the opening of a door. It's not a mind-blowing gadget, but it's something. It's definitely the first, and really only, gadget I think of when I think of Ratchet & Clank 3's gadgets. The lack of focus on platforming and innovative gadgets isn't a dagger through the heart sort of situation. Ratchet & Clank 3 is still a fun game, but the consequence is that it doesn't feel quite as Ratchet & Clanky. It's like a part of its identity has not died, but faded away, and is being overshadowed by the oppressive force of the focus on combat. It's not a net negative, nothing about any aspect of the gameplay is bad, I just would have liked for there to be a bit more of a balance. There are a few sections where you just play as Clank, following in the footsteps of the Clank levels in the previous games, only this time accompanied by a monkey. Apart from the monkey, these level segments are almost exactly the same as they were before. They're still pretty fun, I like them, especially the one where they're filming an episode of Secret Agent Clank, the James Bond ripoff. I suppose I also have to mention that some of the platforming does come in a brand new form, that being Quark's comics. These are 5 platforming levels that are interspersed between the proper levels, and they're odd? You control Captain Quark and attempt to reach the end of these side-scroller levels by jumping and climbing. It's a pretty vanilla interpretation of platforming, and they're an okay change of pace from all the weapon-based combat. Even if these Quark comic levels also have an amount of weapon-based combat, it was something new, something different, and technically did somewhat balance out the lack of platforming focus in the proper levels. I wasn't over the moon about them because they aren't that fun, they're pretty one-note and lack any sort of innovation, but they aren't miserable experiences either. At first I thought they were just an odd detour, a distraction, the kind of shit that third in the trilogy games often pull for no good reason. But they actually are here for a good reason, as they're, unbelievably, relevant to the plot. They tell the story of the rivalry between Captain Quark and Dr. Nefarious, the antagonist of this game. And these Quark comic levels guide the heroes in their efforts to stop Dr. Nefarious from succeeding in his evil scheme. The story of Ratchet & Clank 3 essentially boils down to a race war. Dr. Nefarious is a robot, and he hates organic life forms. He wants to use his bio-obliterator to turn all organic life forms, or squishies as he calls them, into robots. Squishies is of course the Ratchet & Clank universe's equivalent of the N-word. Ratchet and friends, obviously being squishies, don't want this to happen, so they take the fight to Dr. Nefarious, and playing Quark's comics gives them valuable intel on what Dr. Nefarious's plans actually are. The story of this game is odd, not in terms of its premise. Race war is not an idea invented by the developers, they merely adopted it to make a video game so they could profit monetarily off of racism. But I find it really strange the way the game tells the story. I said at the beginning that the pacing of it was really fast. Too fast. Everything was happening in quick succession, without any characters stopping to think about anything. There's no time for exposition or explanation, no time to take a breather, it's just go, go, go. Almost like the game is just trying to get through it. The familiar characters don't really feel like themselves, something about them is off, they feel like husks of what they once were. The new characters have quite bland personalities, and Dr. Nefarious feels like he's trying way too hard to be a dangerous maniac, when really he's just constantly screaming like a baby whose balls dropped too early. And then there are plot points and elements that I don't really understand. Quark has been the bad guy for 2 games in a row. Why, may I ask, are Ratchet & Clank so willing to go along with his Q-Force when they have no reason to trust him at all? Ratchet himself at one point even says that Quark can't be trusted and it'll probably just betray them again. He was wrong, in the end Quark saves the day, but it doesn't make any logical sense to set him up for redemption when he clearly shows no remorse. Earlier on, he lost his memory and thought he was a monkey. He shouldn't care about anything, and Ratchet & Clank were fools to just go along with it. Then there are other plot elements that I just couldn't wrap my head around. How did Ratchet & Clank end up in this army? What's the backstory behind that? Am I forgetting something that happened in the previous games? I don't remember them joining the army. What was the point of this evil version of Clank? I get that Dr. Nefarious was trying to spy on the Q-Force and kidnapped Clank to replace him with this clunk, but it didn't really have any meaningful bearing on the story, so why do it? Why are we also shoehorning in this random love blossoming between Ratchet and this Sasha woman? I can count the number of times they interacted with each other in person on one hand. It feels like the writers brainstormed a bunch of ideas for the story of this game, but instead of picking the best ideas from the brainstorm to put into the game, they just put the brainstorm into the game. That must be why it feels like the story is rushing itself. It's trying to go in so many directions and do all of these things, but it doesn't have enough time allocated to each of those directions, which is why things feel so abrupt and random and out of nowhere. As is par for the course in Ratchet & Clank, the story involves traveling to various planets. In terms of visuals and music, the game is fantastic, just like its predecessors. It looks and sounds brilliant. But I do have to admit that the planets this time around felt less original. They lacked the magic and charm that was present in the earlier titles. They're still very nice locations, but they feel slightly more generic and definitely less memorable. That's also probably because the levels are shorter in this game, or at least they feel shorter. A lot of them are over before they really have a chance to get going. They feel more linear and generally less interesting to explore. Not by a whole lot, mind you, but it wasn't hitting the same here as it used to. And that, combined with the weird pacing of the story, gave this game a really strange vibe for me. This next sentence is going to sound absurd, but it's genuinely the impression I got while playing this game. Ratchet & Clank 3 seems disinterested in itself. The game feels like it doesn't really want to be doing this, like it's just going through the motions and trying to get it over and done with. The way it tries to breeze through the story, the way the story feels like a hodgepodge of random ideas strung together without much thought, the levels feeling shorter, the gameplay favoring combat over the platforming and exploration of enthralling worlds, the way it doesn't really make an effort to try anything new, aside from the Quark comics, one of those random ideas that strings the story together without much thought. Even the sense of humor feels half-assed. I can't really explain this in any other way, but Ratchet & Clank 3 doesn't feel like it has as much heart and soul as the first 2 games. It has such a sense of, oh alright, here we go again, like it's just doing this because it has to. Obviously that's just a matter of opinion. I've done my best to justify this impression I get from this game, but it's just what my gut is telling me. I get the feeling that Ratchet & Clank 3 would rather be a different game. And that leaves me with such a weird feeling overall with this game. Ratchet & Clank 3 is really good. It's fun and engaging in the same ways that Ratchet & Clanks 1 and 2 were, and I had a blast playing through it. But the fact that it doesn't really feel as fresh, the fact that it's not really trying anything different, the fact that the story isn't quite as gripping, and the fact that it feels like the game doesn't really want to be here, all contribute to Ratchet & Clank 3 being a weaker overall experience than the first 2 games. This is by no means a bad game, it's really solid, and in essence has the same strengths as its predecessors, but it just doesn't hit the same here. It's more of the same, but it's lacking passion. I don't want to discredit the developers because making games is really fucking hard, and it would have taken a lot of work to put this game together. I'm sure they put their hearts and souls into this game, but you can't really tell. I really enjoyed Ratchet & Clank 3, but I do think it's the weakest of the trilogy, and I definitely don't love it enough to shove it up my arsenal.